I'll be honest, I kind of wrote this grinder off. You know, I thought, all right, Baratza is releasing a new version of the Encore ESP. They've taken it, they've maybe changed a couple finishes, slapped a Pro label on it, and jacked up the price. Then I used it, and I found out I was wrong about that. So in this video, we're gonna make some espresso, we're gonna make some filter coffee. I'm going to share exactly how I was wrong, why I think this grinder may be one of the most slept on releases this year, what makes it better than the Encore ESP, and we'll talk about who it is actually for. But I'll start by saying the Encore line on the whole have been and continue to be really great grinders. The original Encore is kind of this legendary icon in the coffee world. It doesn't do espresso very well though, and eventually Baratza released the Encore ESP, which is also a great grinder, more fine-tuned for espresso. They did some very clever things with it and kind of kept it in the same skin as the original Encore. This one, the ESP Pro, takes the Encore ESP and adds even more features to it. And what I find really interesting actually is that the features that Baratza seems to lead with on this grinder are not actually the most noteworthy ones. But before we get into any of that, let's take a really quick overview and look at some of the features. The Encore ESP comes in at $299 US, and this one was actually sent to me by Baratza shortly after they announced this grinder. I went and saw it at the Coffee Expo in Houston. Now, when it comes to my reviews, I never give any manufacturer input on them, and they get to see them for the very first time at the same time as you do. And the first thing that I love about the Encore ESP Pro is that you can set it up for both single dosing and on-demand grinding. Single dosing is how I have it set up now. You weigh out and grind one serving of coffee at a time. It's very nice if you are switching coffees a lot or going back and forth between filter and espresso a lot. But you can also set it up for on-demand grinding, which uses this hopper here. And this is probably what you think of when you think of a traditional coffee grinder. You have this thing that you fill up with beans and it grinds a little bit at a time. Now I'm going to grind up some beans here in the single dosing workflow. Very useful if you obsess over freshness, that type of thing. And I'm going to weigh out a serving of espresso into this little cap here. I'm going to do an 18-gram shot of espresso. This is a coffee from Hatch. It's a semi-washed geisha, actually. Very nice coffee, very lightly roasted coffee. And what I'm going to do is I've got my grind size set already. If I just give that a little tap, you can see that it is set to 16. So that's pretty fine because this is a very light coffee. Anything under 40 is going to be considered an espresso setting, and you can adjust that just by turning this up here. So I'm going to dump my coffee in, put the cap on, and then I'm gonna let it grind. And when it's all done, it'll kind of run for an extra couple seconds just like that. And it will show you the amount of time that it took, about 17.4 seconds in that case. Really, it was more or less done shortly before that. And then it will spit out your coffee here. Now, one of the things Baratza has included in this grinder that wasn't on the previous is anti-static tech. And you can see it's done pretty well for anti-static. Still a little bit though of static, you know, little bits kind of coming out and clinging to the insides of this little chamber here. If you totally want to get rid of that, I would suggest doing a little spritz of water on your beans. That's called RDT before you grind things up and, you know, shake them up. And before I take this out, what I'm just going to do is I'm just going to move this up and down, and that's going to move some air through and just clean out any retention. It's called grinds hanging out in there. We will come back to that. First though, let's make this espresso. All right, let's see how this tastes. This is a nice cup of coffee. This is a very lively cup of coffee, very floral. I'm getting some sticky sweet acidity coming through, like think grapefruit with brown sugar on it, but with some kind of floral thing. I like this type of coffee. It's not everybody's thing, but And one of the things that I love about the Encore ESP and ESP Pro is they're very forgiving to pull on espresso. You know, the burrs create enough fines where you're going to be able to generate some good body and sweetness, and that's also going to give you a bit of a wider sweet spot when it comes to dialing in now. That being said, Baratza's done something very interesting with this grinder and the ESP, and that is they've done a kind of two-stage thread pitch on the adjustment. So the filter range uses a coarser thread, so bigger adjustment, and then the thread shifts, and it shifts to a finer thread on the Espresso range, which means you get more granularity, more fidelity, more fine tuning when it comes to what you can adjust. Now, a big difference with the ESP Pro is that it is a stepless grinder. You know, when you're adjusting it, you'll see the numbers change on here, but there's no actual clicks. You can kind of adjust fluidly between all of your settings, and this gives you a little bit more precision. I did do some darks on this grinder as well, and I found that, you know, you just go up a little bit more coarse than I was working with here. Very tasty across the board. Now, one other change that they've made is up in here, they've added this little anti-popcorning dome here, and under that, they've added this flow control disc, which controls the feed rate of the coffee into the burrs, actually slowing it down. That's gonna make for a more uniform grind coming out. Now I'm going to coarsen up the grind here, and we're going to make ourselves a pour over. So I'm going to go back to about 50. I'm going to go just past, and then I'm going to tighten up. And one thing when you're using grinders like this that can really help with your consistency is always approach your grind size from the same side. Now, I mentioned retention. You know, when I would open this grinder up, clean it out, see how much is in there, I would find that sometimes there would be a little bit of retention, not terrible by any stretch, up to a half gram though in some cases. Doing that thing with the bellows really helped with that. But one thing that I find helpful is if you just take a handful of beans and put them in here and just grind them up at your new grind setting before you do your main grind, that'll kind of push out any retention that might be hanging out in there, and that avoids you getting any kind of espresso grinds in your pour over or vice versa. I found that it flowed okay, like it didn't stall even if I didn't do that, but also I got a cleaner cup if I did that. And we're just going to grind this up. Again, no RDT, just so you can see the static on a lighter roast coffee on a coarser grind setting. There's a little light in here too. That's a really nice ad actually that I forgot to mention. And you can see there is a little bit more static in here. So it's not totally no static, especially, you know, if you're doing light roasts and using this cup on filter grind settings. If you don't want to do RDT where you're spraying water, which does really help to minimize it, you can use this catch bin right here, and that will help keep more of that stuff contained. Now, if single dosing isn't your thing, you can just stick on this hopper, fill it up full of coffee. You can use it just like the original Encore if you want, where you're just kind of manually turning things on or off. Or, this is kind of cool, you can hold this in for 3 seconds and it'll change to what's called timer mode. And you can see the time displayed on here. And what that'll do is once you set the time to get the right amount of coffee for you, it will automatically grind to the 10th of a second and do that the same every time. And another cool feature that they added is if you are using single dosing mode, when it's all done, like you saw, it will stop on its own. You don't need to turn it off. All right, let's see how this tastes. That's still a little hot, but that is a very nice brew. It's a nice sweetness. It's not too heavy in body. Complex, nice structure, very nice cup of pour over. Now, for any grinder to do both espresso and pour over reasonably well at this price point, that in itself is something worth noting. But there are a couple things that I particularly like about this grinder. Baratza really seems to kind of lead with that adjustability, you know, that 270 degrees of stepless grind adjustment. You know, it's like 2.2 microns or something, you know, between each degree on the espresso range, as well as the anti-static tech. Both those things are nice and a nice improvement over the original ESP. Static isn't totally eliminated though, as you saw, but I like something else about this grinder. That auto off and timer function on here, as well as this rotary encoder here on the front. You see, the old Baratzas, you had to turn them on and off manually, and it was with some pretty cheap feeling switches. Now, Encores last for forever. You know, they are very good grinders. Baratza has a lot of trips around the block with this stuff. It's just that those touch points are a little cheap feeling to me. This knob right here feels great to turn the grinder on and off, so much better than that switch. Not only that though, but turning the grinders off was manual on the old Encores, either by the switch on the side or releasing that front button. And just not having to worry about that when you're single dosing is really nice, let alone how much better it feels with the rotary encoder. But when you're on demand grinding, you know, if single dosing isn't your thing and you have that hopper on there and you just have that timer set to spit out exactly the same amount of coffee, it is just such a nice feature. I really can't overstate how nice those two features are, in particular when it comes to workflow. In fact, I would even probably say that even for just those two features, without any other improvements at all, are worth the extra $100 on this grinder. You see, when you're turning the grinder on and off manually, you're just kind of guessing, you know, how much coffee to grind up, and then you're either left with not enough grounds and you got to grind on a little bit more, you know, turn it on and off really quickly, or you have too much and you got too much espresso grinds in your catch bin or whatever, and they're just going to sit in there and go stale way more quickly than if they're whole bean. Being able to have that taken care of and have it 100% consistent is such a nice upgrade in a grinder at this price point. Also, the original Encore and the ESP, they both felt very plasticky, you know, to touch them and feel them, which, you know, they worked fantastic. So it's not a huge deal, but it just was the way they felt. And on this grinder, Baratza has updated all these front panels to metal, and it really makes for a much more premium feel and look, especially when you combine in this nice little screen right here, the rotary encoder, and the lighting under here. So all that is a really nice change too. Now, in terms of getting in the grinder to clean it out, something I recommend you do periodically, if you have the hopper on, you know, you're doing on-demand grinding, this is so slick. I wish more grinders had this, but what you do is you can see it's open there like that. You just twist this like that, and it will seal the beans off that are in there. And then you can just lift it out and you're only left with a very small amount of beans left in here. Very nice. Then when you're all done, you can put it back on and unlock it and you're ready to go again. Once that is off, what you do is you just go to the coarsest setting, and this assembly will pop out with this little anti-popcorning dome on here. You just open the quick release here, pop it off. I wish every grinder had this quick release function. You pull off the flow control disc here. You can pull out your outer burr here with this little handle, and then you can take the inner burr out to give everything a nice little clean. The ESP Pro uses the same M2 burr as the Baratza ESP. These are made by Etzinger. These are very nice burrs, very flexible burrs. And I even think that these burrs are a little bit better suited to what a lot of people might actually need than some of the other options out there. More on that in a bit. Once all this is out, you can clean the whole inside in there. You have access to the paddle wheel that will kind of move all the grinds out. It looks like they redesigned that compared to the last Encore that I had, and I have to say it seems like it does help the retention a little bit. When you put the burr back in, you just have to make sure that you're lining up all of the little grooves so that it goes in the proper way. Then you can put the flow control disc back on, the quick release, it's reverse threaded, just so you're aware of that. And then you put this little bad boy on, twist it up, and you're good to go. Now, before you do anything like this, I forgot to do this, you really should unplug your grinder first. Just a little note there. Now, materials and sustainability wise, the Encore ESP Pro is made in Taiwan, which is great. Taiwan is a great place to manufacture, good labor laws there. Materials wise, as I mentioned, there is a lot more metal on this one than on previous Encores, but there still is a fair bit of plastic, very expected in this price range. One thing that I actually love about Baratza is they stand behind their grinders with after sale support and parts. So if you have an issue with your Encore, you want a new set of burrs, you need a part, you can get in touch with Baratza and get a part. Being able to service your stuff, really great. Now, before we get to some cons and considerations, a couple quick stats on the Encore ESP Pro. I found time-wise for an espresso shot, the way I like to do espresso, I typically do like 18 grams. I would find, you know, somewhere in between the 15 to 20 second mark. Filter, I was finding it closer to the 10 second mark. Volume, it's a little quieter than the ESP for sure, and this lid actually really helps with that. So, you know, without the lid, I was finding it was hovering, you know, somewhere around 77, 78 dB, you know, when you're just standing in front of it. With this lid, that actually knocked the volume down to like 73, 74 dB. You know, some grinders can really squeal. This is not really that type of sound. Fidelity on Espresso, that's like how much adjustability that you have. I was finding, you know, between say 17 and 17.5, depending on the coffee that I was using, could be anywhere from like 1.5 to 4 seconds. All in all, that's more than enough wiggle room to end up very happy day to day when you're making espresso. When it came to retention, I found it retained slightly more with espresso, up to 0.5 grams, still very reasonable, and a little bit less on filter. Again, if you are doing single dosing, I would recommend just pushing this up and down a couple times, and that really helps. All in all, pretty solid performance, especially at the price point of 300 bucks. Not a perfect grinder though. So if you're considering this, what are some things that you might want to have on your radar? It is really easy to like slip and think you're turning the adjustment, but really you're not. And really you have to kind of really pinch this in order to be sure that you're actually adjusting it. And then still the line between pinching and slipping is pretty slim. So if you want to avoid that, you can just adjust it without this. I don't know if Baratza might update this cap at some point to have a little more grippy surface in there, but I did find that that could be a bit of a frustration. When you're inside the grinder, that redesigned paddle seems to help with retention a little bit. Underneath that paddle, there's this little felt washer type thing. And that is a part that I have broken a couple times inadvertently on other Encores while I've been cleaning. It's the type of thing that will wear out. So just a note that that is I'm gonna call that a high wear part that you may need to replace at some point. The stepless grind adjustment is cool, but again, you're kind of limited by the numbers that you can actually see on the display since there aren't any like ticks on the actual thing that shows you where you're at. And one thing that bugged me a little bit more than it should, if you're using it on timer mode and you have your time set in and you go to unplug your grinder and put it in a different spot in your kitchen, or if you need to pull stuff out to clean and you unplug your grinder, it will forget your time setting. So if you ever are going to unplug your grinder and you're using it on timer mode, make sure that you note your time setting first. The anti-static, ionizer, whatever you want to call it in here, it's nice that they have done that, and more grinders are including something like that. Just my personal opinion, I think Baratza might be overselling a little bit on that. Clearly it still can be quite staticky, especially if you're not using RDT, depending on your relative humidity, all that type of thing. I did find it was the worst on filter, and if you were using the dosing cup. If you use this, that helps a little bit. If you're on espresso, it was a little bit better in my experience. Not totally gone in any case, for sure. Overall, definitely some cons and quirks. However, this grinder is probably for the next while going to be my top recommendation at this price point. Let me tell you why that is. If you're not sure if you want to do a single dosing workflow or an on-demand workflow, like maybe you've heard about single dosing grinders, you think, it sounds cool, but I don't know, like, do I want to weigh out my beans every time? Is it worth maybe a little extra freshness and being able to switch beans? Number one, the workflow on either single dosing or on demand feels very native. The auto off, the timer function, it's wonderful that they've included that. But if you want to experiment and you want to try one, you want to try the other, this grinder is one of the best setup grinders, especially at this low price point, to be able to do both. And another thing that I think this grinder really has going for it is those burrs. Now, if you watch a lot of YouTube videos, you'll see people talking about flat burrs. And I use flat burr coffee grinders. I quite enjoy them. They offer a very unique range of profiles, higher clarity, and some more entry-level flat burr grinders like the DF54, for example, come in even cheaper than this grinder. And based on what you see online, you might think, oh, well, you'd be crazy to suggest something like this with these conical burrs when you can get a flat burr grinder for less than this. And if you really want to get into flat burrs, then that's a fair point. However, in my years of reviewing stuff, I have seen this story over and over and over again, where people who are getting into coffee do a lot of research on YouTube and they think, oh, I need to buy a flat burr grinder. And they do that, and it ends up being a lot more finicky to dial in than they expect. They have this kind of awful experience trying to learn to use this thing, and then they decide that it's actually terrible and they go back to using whatever they were doing before. And conical burrs tend to be more forgiving a wider sweet spot generally. Also, flat burrs can give you more clarity. Sometimes that is at the expense of body in a general sense. And a lot of coffee enthusiasts actually like that. But a lot of times people think, it's just too thin, you know? And a grinder like this with this style of burr is going to give you good sweetness, good complexity, nice flattering cups, and in a package that's very easy to dial in. And that's not even getting into like the auto off, the timer, the ability to switch between on demand and single dosing very easily, the very nice fit and finishes that the Encore ESP Pro has. There just is a lot that it has going for it at the $300 mark. Now, if you're the type of person who you know already, I love to just fuss over my coffee. I like to obsess over every little detail. And if it takes me 4 shots to dial in, that pulls me in harder, and getting to that final result, that process is all a part of it for you. And you really want to dig in at a high level of detail. Those flat burr grinders, you know, they can be a good option. Grinders like this will get you to an enjoyable cup a lot more quickly. And if you see people like me saying that flat burr grinders are not as difficult to dial in as you think, just take it with a grain of salt. Grinders like this with conical burrs, they're just easier. You know, overall, the original Encore ESP, I liked that grinder a lot. And when Baratza released this one, I thought, okay, this is going to be a solid grinder, but more or less I just hit the snooze button. And honestly, I ended up being pretty impressed, surprised with it. I was kind of wrong on that. You know, it's not just a reskin. Baratza has done some stuff with this grinder, added some features that just really take the workflow up and above a couple notches. If you want no fuss, good coffee, nice polish, nice look on the counter, highly recommend this grinder. Really pleased to see this from Baratza. Now, I'm gonna leave my review for the original Baratza ESP. If you wanna watch that, you can for sure, but I wanna hear what you think of this grinder. Are those extra features worth the extra $100 to you, or would you rather save $100 and get something closer to the original ESP? If you're an owner of an original Encore or an ESP, I would love to hear your thoughts on the updates that Baratza has made. I hope your next cup of coffee is fantastic, and we'll see you next time.